Can you guys hear me? Okay. Can you guys see the screen also? Okay. So we'll start. So today we are at live session 6. We'll be covering lecture 16 to 18. Just 1 second. Okay. So yeah, as always, here are some important links. So today we'll be talking about the module community ecology. Uh, we'll talk about community nature and parameters, community changes and ecological succession, and also community organization. And in the next module, we'll talk about distribution and abundance of species. So we'll start week 6 community ecology. So the first lecture was on community nature and parameters. So first, what is a community? So as we have been defining these terms since the past few classes, a community is basically a assemblage or a group of populations of living organisms that live in a particular prescribed area or a habitat and interact with one another. Right. So the other thing that we learned, which was new for us, was something called an ecotone. So what is an ecotone? So ecotone is basically a transition area where two communities meet and integrate. So for example, here in the image, you can see that um, this line here is basically like the dividing line between the forest, which is on this side of the line mostly, and the grassland, which is on this side of the line. So this line is called a ecotone. In this case, it's a sharp ecotone because on one side of the ecotone there's grassland, on the other side there's forest. So there's no mixing of them. There's a steep like line between both of them. But we might have cases where, for example, let's say we have an area where there's forest, and then slowly the number of trees decrease. And on the other side, we have grassland. So from here to here, we can definitely say it's a forest. And from here to here, we can definitely say it's a grassland. But this part here is somewhat in between. So there are trees, but there are also a lot of grasses. So it's like the either the grassland is coming into the forest or the forest is going into the grassland. So this region also is called as an ecotone. And in this case, it will be a diffuse ecotone because it doesn't have a sharp dividing line between both the communities, right, or habitats. So we also talked about community attributes. So community attributes are things that are common across all communities. So the first attribute is co-occurrence of species. So in a community, let's say we have one species and another species A and species B, which are linked together or basically have some relation with each other, then both of them will tend to co-occur. Okay. So for example, let's say we have a sal forest in general, where we have a sal forest, we also have mallotus trees in between the sal trees. So sal trees are like these larger trees, and then in between them we have all these mallotus trees also. Right. So these two species are said to co-occur because in a community, if you find one of them, you are very likely to find the other. Right. The second attribute is recurrence of groups of the same species. So let's say we have a large area and we have like, let's say three patches of forest, three patches of sal forest. So here we have one patch, here we have another, here we have the third. in all of these patches, 1, 2, 3, if we have sal, we'll also have mallotus. So that means like both the species that co-occur tend to recur across different places also. So basically, that's another attribute of communities. Same species or similar, the same group of species often tend to recur across different communities. And the third attribute is homeostasis or self-regulation. So basically, homeostasis is basically like maintaining everything at the same level, kind of. So let's say, for example, um, we have a forest where we have a tree, and then we have three species of insects on the tree, and let's say we have two species of birds that um, feed on these insects. Bird insect, right? So all of them, basically, all the birds feed on all the insects, and all the insects reside in the same species of tree, right? So, and let's say if we are to make a abundance table of all these, let's say this species is present, like the 10 individuals of this species, the 12 individuals of this species, and let's say 15 individuals of the species. There's, let's say, one tree, and there basically, let's say, mm, two birds of this species and three birds of this species, right? So homeostasis basically means that, so this is a state of a system. This is, let's say, the natural state of a community. And let's say due to some reason, let's say due to migration or something, uh, this species two of insect increases in number quite a bit. So let's say now instead of 12, we have, let's say, 200 insects of this species. Or sorry, let's say 100 insects of this species, right? And the other numbers are the same. So what happens is, since the birds feed on all three types of insects, and the insect species 2 is more frequently available, then birds will tend to come in contact more with species 2 of insects and will tend to eat more and more of them, right? So the number of individuals of species 2 will decrease over time. And after some time, you will see that this number will tend to come back to somewhere around the value that was originally there. So this is basically known as homeostasis or self-regulation. So basically the abundance and the diversity of a given community, the abundance of species and the composition tends to regulate itself through mechanisms such as the food web, and uh, yeah, other relations that these animals have between relations and interactions that these animals have between each other, or animals and plants have between each other. Right. Is that clear? Does anyone have any doubts? Okay. So next we come to community characteristics. So community characteristics are things that characterize a given community, and they might differ from one community to the other. Unlike community attributes, which are like things that happen in all the communities, like every community has co-occurrence of species, every community has recurrence of the same group of species, and every community has uh, homeostasis or self-regulation. But community characteristics are characteristics that define a community and that can vary between one community or another community, or one area and another area. So the first thing is species diversity. So basically, which species are living together in the community. That is something that can vary from one community to another. Okay. The second thing is the growth form and structure. So basically, things like trees, shrubs, herbs, and the vertical stratification is something that can vary between different communities. So, for example, um, in one place in a rainforest community, you might have very tall trees followed by some shorter trees, then very small herbs and shrubs, and then maybe even some mosses or ferns. Right, so there's a vertical stratification. So these tall trees generally occupy most of the canopy. The plants that are present in the understory are more shade tolerant and they come up to a certain height only. And then we have these lower level, which has mostly herbs, shrubs, and other mosses and stuff. Right. So this structure may differ from one community to another. Some communities might have a understory, some communities might not have an understory, and so on. Right. For example, like grassland communities generally tend to have only grasses, but not a lot of these vertical stratification, grasses and maybe some trees. Right. So things like this, the forms of growth and the structure of the ecosystem, the structure of the community might vary from one community to another. The third thing is dominance. So dominance basically relates to the dominant species. So the dominant species in a given community are those that are highly successful ecologically and determine to a considerable extent the conditions under which other associated species must grow. Right. So, for example, if you have a forest, sal forest, you have these very tall sal trees, right? And they carry out many of the functions of the ecosystem, right? Such as like uh, is, uh, you know, primary production, transpiration, things like that. So they basically determine the microclimate of the area under them. So the amount of light that will come here, the amount of humidity, the amount of moisture in the air that might be there here will be influenced by these larger and more numerous sal trees in a sal forest. So they are said to be the dominant species because they determine the uh, conditions under which other species can grow in the community. Right. Uh, the fourth thing is relative abundance. So basically, the proportion of different species in the community can vary from one community to another. And the final thing is the trophic structure. So the trophic structure can also vary from one community to another because in we might have different species of animals that are present in one community and different species of animals that are present in another. So sometimes we may not have certain trophic levels or we may have more trophic levels in a given community compared to another. Okay. So community description is basically what variables or factors we use to describe a community. So the first thing is species richness, so which is basically the number of species that are present in the given community. The second thing is species abundance. So abundance is basically the amount or the number of individuals or the amount of biomass that is present on the cover of uh, the area covered by the species. So number of individuals is straightforward. So for each species, you have how many individuals are there in that given community. Biomass is basically if you take all the animals or all the plants of the given species, what will be the combined biomass? And cover is basically, so let's say you have a area and let's say you have many different species. Let's say one species is mostly found here. Then there's another species which is mostly found along this line. Right. So the cover is basically the area out of the total area, the area of the whole square that is occupied by this given species. And for this species, the cover will be this plus this. divided by the whole area. Right. Then the third thing we use to describe communities is called species dominance. So basically, here we are ranking species based on their abundance. So let's say species one has 1,000 individual species, two has 800 species three, that's 500, and so on. So we rank uh, like yeah, basically we rank the species based on how many number of individuals they have or the basal area and other things like that. So the basal area is basically, let's say, a forest. We have certain trees. So these are trees of the same species. So let's say you have a line here at some height. So the basal area is this area, this divided by the whole that covers the whole land that covers the forest. So this is generally used for trees to determine the amount of area that they occupy divided by. So basically, the area that is there in this part are all the trees of that species or all the individuals of that species. Okay. Next, based on these different variables that we can measure, such as the basal area or the number of individuals or even the frequency of individuals or frequency of species. So what do you mean by the frequency of species first? So frequency of species is basically, let's say you have a quadrant like this. You have three species. So, so let's say you have an area like this. And what we do is we take quadrants inside the area. Okay. And then we see, so this is one species, this is another, this is the third. So in quadrant one, we have this species and we have species. We don't have this. In quadrant two, we have all three. Right. Let's say we have another quadrant here where we have both of these species again. And then we have another quadrant here where we have these two species. So basically, now the frequency of this species would be 4 by 4 because in all of the quadrants, we see the species. The frequency of this species would be 3 by 4 because we out of all four quadrants, we see it in three quadrants. And for this species, similarly, it will be 1 by 2 or 2 by 4 because in half of the quadrants, we see the species. So this is basically the frequency of a given species. So based on these terms, the frequency, the basal area, and the number of individuals, we have uh, other metrics that we can calculate. For example, the relative density, which is basically number of individuals of a given species X divided by total number of all species. So total number of individuals in the community into 100. The relative frequency is defined as frequency of a given species X divided by sum of frequencies of all different species in the community into 100. And the relative dominance is basically the basal area of species X divided by total basal area of all the species into 100. So the importance of a species is then given as relative density plus relative frequency plus relative dominance. So relative density is how mm, many individuals are there. Relative frequency is how what is a mm, if the species has a high probability of being encountered in the community, and relative dominance is if they occupy the more area. It- So all three, if they are doing all three, they basically have a higher importance value. So if they have higher relative density, relative frequency, and relative dominance, they'll have high importance value, and they'll be generally the species that are the most dominant species in the community. And since all three values are basically range from 0 to 100, the maximum value that you can get for importance is basically 300. So the importance value or value also ranges from 0 to 300. Okay. Hmm. Another thing is, so what kind of, so based on encountering a given species, what can we say about if the species are associating or not? So let's say we have two species, species X and species Y, and let's say we do quadrat sampling, and we find out that if in a quadrat both the species are present, that quadrat is the association is called type A. If species Y is present, species X is absent, that association is called type B. If species Y is absent, species X is present, it's called type C. And if both of them are absent, it's called type D. So if two species are associating, or if they are basically living together or like drawing some benefits from each other, but basically occur together, what that means is if you see one of them, you're very likely to see the other one, right? So if two species are associating, they are more likely to have type A associations, but they are also more likely to have type D associations because if two species are regularly associating and like they have some function that is carried out by both of them, or they're functionally basically helping each other out in some way or depending upon each other, then if one species is not present, the other species are also less likely to be present. So these two kind of association, type A and type D, are basically seen in places where you have a positive association between both the species, if both of them are helping each other or if one of them is helping the other. But if there is some negative association between the species, for example, if both of them are harming each other, then we see that if species Y is present, species X is not present, or if species X is present, species Y is not present. So if there is negative association, then we see these two kind of associations in all the sample quadrants in a given community or area. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Next, we talk about community theories. So community theories are like theories that have been put forward by people to understand basically how communities occur and what are communities basically. So Clements gave the organismic theory, which basically states that a community is a discrete unit or a superorganism with very sharp boundaries. And communities are basically, what do you say? Mm, have some hierarchy and basically exhibit properties that are more than the sum of its individual parts. And it is assumed that species interactions play a major role in the development and regulation of communities, according to Clements. Right. So basically, for him, a community is like a super organism. So basically, if you think of a community as a larger organism, all the species, different species of animals or different populations of animals that exist within the community are basically the organs or the organ systems. Right. The other theory that was put forward by Hubble was the neutral theory, where he says that all species are functionally equivalent, and the abundance of a population of a species changes by random births or deaths. So he's like everything is neutral. The interactions don't matter that much. Like all species are basically functionally equivalent, And it is due to random chance that we are seeing a given community in one place and another community in another place. Okay. Gleason put forward his individualistic or continuum theory, where basically the abundance of a population of species changes gradually along complex environmental gradients. And according to this view, communities are not tightly structured, but are merely coincidences resulting from chance dispersals, environmental sorting, and species interactions. So communities are less predictable. Species interactions have a much reduced role in determining the structure of the community. So what this basically means is that, what he means is that, so let's say we have a large area here, and here, let's say temperature from this corner to this corner goes from low to high, and let's say humidity goes from low to high on this side, right? So what Gleason's basically means is that there might be different species that favor different climatic conditions, and due to chance dispersal they might be forming a community. So for example, this species mostly likes to stay in a place that has low temperature and high humidity. But there are some individuals that are also found in other areas. Similarly, we might have another species which is mostly found in high temperature and high humidity areas, but some of the individuals have dispersed to other areas also as well. And let's say we have a third community here, which likes some moderate temperature and humidity, but some of these individuals are also dispersed into different areas. And we have another species which basically stays in high temperature, low humidity areas like a desert, but some individuals are also found in other areas. So what Gleason basically says is that these communities that we see in different places, for example, if we look at here, we might see a community composed of squares and circles, or if we look slightly here, we might have community of square, circles, and crosses. But here we might have a community of only squares, crosses, and triangles. So basically, different communities arise due to uh, chance dispersal and basically environmental sorting. So basically, these species are sorted according to the environmental variables they are most attuned to. For example, this species mostly is found in this area because it has high humidity and low temperature, whereas this species is mostly found in this area because it has high temperature and low humidity. But you can find them interacting in some places that are in between them in some climatic gradient. So basically, they're not coming together to form a community, but they are randomly present in the same area. Not random, they're present in the same area due to some climatic uh, conditions or due to some complex climatic or environmental gradients. And because of that, they tend to interact with each other and form a community. In Gleason's view, communities are less predictable and species interactions have a much reduced role in determining the structure. What determines the structure of a community? So from going to this community to, let's say, this community or this community, the structure is mostly determined by the environmental or climatic gradients and not by the um, species interactions. Okay, so yeah, according to Clements, everything is basically determined by species interaction. The community is like a superorganism. Hubble says that all species are functionally equivalent and everything is random chance. And Gleason says that it's all due to environmental and complex climatic gradients. Right. Does anyone have any questions till now? Okay. Then we talked about gills. So gills are basically a group of species which utilize resources in the same way. For example, a group of birds that are eating fruits might consist of different species of birds, uh, but they are using the same fruit or probably similar fruit. Yeah, they're using basically, let's say we have a mango tree and we have lots of different birds that have come to the mango tree to eat the mangoes. They're all basically a guild of fruit eating birds because they're eating fruits. We also have other examples can be a guild of uh, forest floor dwelling herbs. So basically, these herbs are dwelling in the forest floor. They're occupying the same resource, utilizing the same resources, which is the floor of the forest, and so on. And because species that are present within a guild utilize the same resources, we expect them to compete with each other more strongly than with species from different guilds. So, for example, let's say you have a bird that eats fruits. We have species A, which eats fruits, and we have species B, which eats fruits, whereas we have species C and species B, both of which eat insects. So species A and B belong to the same guild. Species C and D belong to the same guild. And species A and B will have more competition, will have to compete more strongly with each other compared to species A and species C, let's say. Because species A and B are both utilizing the same resource, which is fruits. And similarly, species C and D compete with each other more compared to any of these species competing with species A or species B. Right. Then we also talked about niche. So the niche, as we had earlier defined it, was the role that a species plays in the ecosystem or a habitat. Now we are just slightly changing it. So basically, the elaborating on it. So the ecological niche of a species is a multi-dimensional description of its resource needs, habitat requirements, and environmental tolerances. So, for example, let's say we have three axes. One, we have temperature from low to high, so this is 0 or something. We have humidity, sunlight. Let's say we have a fourth axis also. Uh, okay, let's say we have these three axes. So basically, we are putting uh, different species of plants into this three-dimensional space. So you can think of it as a multi-dimensional space. So you can add more variables to it. List is not in, but let's say we have some species A which occupies this place. We have species B which occupies this place. So species B needs more sunlight, but more sunlight and humidity, but maybe less temperature than species A. Uh, Similarly, we have, let's say, species C, which needs slightly more temperature and humidity than species A. And basically, so niche is basically the place of a species in this multidimensional space. Right, so this area here is the niche of species A, this is the niche of species C, this is the niche of species B. Right. Now again, we have two kinds of niche for a given species, the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche is a potential set of conditions which a species can occupy. It is generally determined experimentally. So what do we mean? So let's say now we just flatten all these axes. So we have temperature, humidity, we have sunlight. Okay. So let's say for a given species, let's say species A, it can range from, let's say, 25 to 50 degrees Celsius. Right. Let's say it can tolerate this much amount of humidity. If you do experiments and figure out, and it can tolerate this much amount of sunlight. So this area in this plot inside this polygon is basically the fundamental niche of this given species A. So the fundamental niche is determined experimentally. So you basically take individuals from the given species, you put them in different temperatures, put them in different humidities, put them in different sunlight, and you see where they are able to survive and where they are not able to survive. Now, the realized niche is basically the set of conditions which a species is actually occupying in a community due to effects such as competition, predation, etc. It is determined through field observations and it is also known as post-competitive niche. So, for example, let's say we have species A which can survive in all these various temperature, humidity, and sunlight. But in that same area, we also have another species, species B, which can also survive in similar conditions. Right. So now due to competition, what has happened is species A, so species A in that area is no longer found in the higher temperatures, which is the higher temperatures are mostly occupied by species B. Right. And similarly, the lower humidity values are occupied by species B, and so on. So now we have a smaller area here, which is the area that is actually occupied by species A in the given community. Whereas the larger outside area is the area that species A can theoretically occupy if there is no competition or predation, other interactions with other population. Right. So basically, the outer thing here is the fundamental niche, and the inner thing here is the realized niche. And always the realized niche is lesser than or equal to the fundamental niche. If there is no competition, realized niche, if there is no competition, predation, or any other effects, realized niche will be equal to the fundamental niche. So the animal or the organism or the species will occupy um, all the potential set of conditions which it can occupy. But if there is some other effect, then basically the niche is shrunken and we have a smaller niche which we call this a realized niche. Okay. Yeah, so the first thing is fundamental niche is always greater than or equal to realized niche. Realized niche can never be greater than fundamental niche. Realized niche for population of the same species may differ because of difference in extent conditions at two locations. So even if we have, let's say, here species A, and in this area, we have species A and species B. Right. So we have two populations that are kind of far away. Okay. So let's say this is species A is basically bamboo, and species B is basically elephants. So elephants eat bamboo. So since there are no elephants in this region, this bamboo can occupy a very large area and it can occupy most of its fundamental needs. So it can go into areas that have where it, till its thermal tolerance, till its humidity tolerance, salinity tolerance, and things like that. Whereas in this area, in the yeah, in the second area, even if like so, these are basically different environmental variables. Let's say humidity and temperature. Again, temperature and humidity. So let's say here bamboo can occupy all these different places, but here in this area, it cannot occupy all these different places because species B is there and it is predating upon it and eating it basically. So let's say here it occupies only this portion of the area. Right. So even though we have species A here and species A here, the realized niche for both of them are different in these two communities because the conditions at these two locations of community are different, which is the presence of species B. The third thing is specialist species have narrow niches. So specialist species are species that specialize in something or basically they focus on a particular resource and basically are adapted to use the resource in a much better way compared to other species. So they basically tend to have very narrow niches. So they'll live for they're very tightly clustered around the resource that they are using. So the amount of thermal and other tolerance that they have is not that much. It's only restricted to the areas where the resource is found. Whereas generalist species are species that basically feed on a lot of different things, and they need to be able to survive in a broad environmental condition. That's why they have generally broad niches. Right. Uh, The fundamental niche elaborates the various roles that a species can take in a community, whereas the realized niche elaborates on what the species is actually doing in a community. Okay. And the final thing is species are well adapted to their realized niches. Since in a community, the realized niche is where the species is occurring. So they are very well adapted to that given area, given niche. Now let's say we have two communities. How do we compare both of them? So to compare two communities, we can have something called an index of similarity. So for example, let's say you have a community here and a community here, and here you have A number of species, here you have B number of species, and in between both these communities, C number of species is common. So the index of similarity is calculated as 2C by A plus B. So 2C is basically all the common species divided by A plus B, which is the total number of species in both the communities combined. So if you have a higher number of C, if you have high C, which is like if there are many species that occur in both the communities, that means that these two communities will have a higher index of similarity. If the value of C is low, which means that there are not a lot of species that are in common between both the communities, that means the index of similarity will be low. Okay. Uh, Based on the association of a species with a community, it can be defined as it can be categorized into various categories. So, accidental species are species that are rare in a community, and they are generally present as, let's say, chance invaders from other community, or they are basically relics from a previous community. Indifferent species are species which have no real affinity to a particular community, but they are not rare. So you'll find them more commonly, but they don't have any affinity for that community. They can also exist without that particular community. Preferential species are species that are present with varying abundance in several communities, but are especially abundant in one particular community. So they prefer that community. Selective species are species that are found most frequently in a particular community, but are also found occasionally in other communities. And exclusive species are species that are almost completely or completely found only in a particular community and not in other communities. Okay. So at the end of first lecture, does anyone have any questions? Okay. So the second lecture was on community changes and ecological succession. So what is ecological succession? So ecological succession is basically the process of change in the species structure of a community over time. So as time passes, the species structure and the abundance of different species in a community tends to change over time, and that process is called ecological succession. So it over time gradually it leads to the change in the overturn or change in the community of the given area. So for example, let's say initially there was some volcanic eruption, and all you have now in a given area are basically bare rocks that are remains of the volcanic eruption, right? So initially, for a very long time, they might just be bare rocks. Then slowly you might see some lichen develop on the bare rocks. So this is known as the crustose lichen stage. So these lichens are very minimalistic organisms that don't require a lot of nutrients, and they are very hardy. So they can basically stay on top of these bare rocks and basically derive their nutrition, and they are also photosynthetic, so they don't need any other organism or animal to thrive. They can make their own food using sunlight, and since their nutrition requirements are very minimal, they can survive on these barren areas like these bare rocks. So once we have crustose lichens, they give way for these foliose lichens. So these are basically another kind of lichen which look more like leaves. That's why they're called as foliose lichens. And these crustose lichens are basically like crusts that are forming on top of these rocks. That's why they're called crustose lichen. So then eventually from these foliose lichens, you might see that after some time, there is some rise of mosses, which are very small plants kind of. Then in these like initial stages, there is a critical thing that is going on, which is basically the weathering of rocks or the formation of soil from rocks. So there are many different environmental and like biological factors that can lead to weathering of rocks. So, for example, freezing of water. So, for example, let's say you have a bare rock area, and for some reason there's some crack in it, right? So, let's say there's a crack because there was some uh, growth of some mosses, so the root growth, or there is some crack because of other things. So in this crack, when it rains or if there's some deposition of water, what happens is, and sometimes if it's quite cold, what happens is this water tends to freeze. And we know that water has the highest density at around 4 degrees Celsius. So as the water cools at 4 degree, it has the highest density. So it is quite densely packed in this hole. Then after 4 degree, once the temperature goes below 4 degrees and the water starts freezing, what happens is the water also expands as it forms ice. And this expansion basically leads to some cracks in these small cracks here. And then eventually in the next round of freezing, these cracks will give way to more cracks and so on. And those cracks tend to form in like large rocks, and basically small all the minerals and other elements that are present in these rocks tend to come out into these cracks. Right. The other thing is the action of sun. And so basically, as the sun comes up every day, it basically heats rocks. And as it sets in the night, as the temperature gets cooler, the rocks tend to shrink or compress. Right. So this expansion and compression keeps on happening every day, like small amounts. And if these rocks are quite large, then after several rounds of these, what will happen is they will start forming cracks in between. Yeah. So these layer kind of things. We have one layer of rocks here, now one layer here, one layer here, and so on. And since if you see this weathering happen in granite and all, it looks like these layer-like things are forming. So one layer on the layer. So that's why this is also called as onion weathering. Okay. The other thing that can happen is basically if there is some water deposition here or some nutrient deposition here along with water, and there is some evaporation. So basically, what is left here is basically the solute or the um, sol yeah, the solute that was present in the water. So basically, salts and stuff get deposited here, and as these depositions tend to grow more and more, they tend to crystallize with the action of the sun. So these crystals tend to become bigger and bigger over time, and they exert forces on these rocks that also lead to formation of cracks. The other thing is like plants such as moss and all, and even like lichens and all might secrete some chemicals or other organic matter such as herbs and all might secrete chemicals from their roots. So for example, if there's a hole here, even if we have a plant which has roots here, so the plant will tend to secrete some chemicals which will tend to dissolve these rocks to produce nutrients, to get nutrients from the rocks. So basically, this also leads to breaking of these rocks, and eventually all these things that lead to weathering of rocks then eventually lead to formation of a layer of small layer of soil over the rock. Okay. So the upper part of the rock is basically now being broken down into small pieces and is basically forming the soil. And as these organic matter such as the moss and the lichen die, they also tend to decay on top of the rocks, and they tend to form what is called as the humus, which basically um, is a very nutrient rich organic layer is also formed on top of these rocks. And then these give way to basically various herbs. And then these herbs give way to shrubs, and these eventually gives way for forests to develop. So basically, this process by which the community is changing and the different organisms that are found at different stages of time along this same area is basically called as ecological succession. Now, what is a seer? A seer or a seral community is an intermediate stage that is found in ecological succession in a ecosystem that is advancing towards its climax community. So there are three things to note first, and we'll talk about them later also in more detail. So basically, initially there is nothing. Then we have a pioneer species. So these are species which are initially found in a given area that is newly formed or basically area where there's no other organism found. These then give rise to seral communities. So community one, community two, so seral community or seer and so on, seer three and so on, and eventually these give rise to the final stage, which is called the climax community. So in the example that we saw, the crustose lichen here would be the pioneer species because they are the ones that are starting this ecological succession. All these other stages, the foliage lichen, moss, herbaceous stage, shrub stage are basically sears or several communities. And this forest stage basically is the climax community. Right. So there are different kinds of seals. Hydrosphere is basically a community in water, several community in water. Xerosphere is a community in a dry area. It includes a lithosphere, which is a community on rock, and Samosphere, which is communities on sand. A halosphere is basically a community in a saline body, for example, in a marshy area. As I was saying before, so pioneer species are hardy species which establish themselves in a disruptive ecosystem and trigger the process of ecological succession. So they are the first forms of living organisms in that ecosystem, in that disrupted ecosystem after the disruption. They have certain characteristics. So, for example, they have the ability to grow on bare rocks. They can grow on nutrient-poor soil and water. And that is why they are often the first species that grow in areas like this because they don't have a lot of nutrient demands. Then we have, then they basically also can tolerate extreme conditions such as heat and cold. They have very less nutritional requirements and are often photoautotrophs, so they don't depend on other organisms for their food. They are often of small size because the amount of food that they will produce, since they have low nutritional requirements, they will produce low amount of food, and that's why they are limited in their size also. They have very short lifespan generally with very rapid growth, and are mostly annual species, so they'll be found in a particular favorable climate, but they will not survive if the climate is not very favorable, and they won't be found year after year. They'll be found only like certain parts of the year. And the final thing, which is one of the most important, is the ability to disperse through spores or seeds. So, because if you have a bare rock area, you have no life or anything there, no living organism there, no ecological community there. So the first organisms that will grow there will basically need to come in some form. So this is generally in the form of spores or seeds, because spores and seeds can tolerate a lot of harsh climates and basically harsh conditions. And when the conditions are favorable, these can give rise to organisms. And they have prolific seed production. So they produce a lot of seeds and they generally spread very far. Okay. Next, we have again the climax community. So, climax community is the biological community of plants, animals, and fungi, which through the process of ecological succession in the development of vegetation in an area over time has have reached a steady state. So, in our case, the forest is the steady state because the forest is a biological community of like plants, animals, and other organisms which can perform homeostasis and basically uh, has reached a steady state with the number of individuals of different populations, where the number of individuals of different populations are basically controlled by many different mechanisms such as trophic levels and other things. So it has reached a steady state and it tends to stay that way for a very long time. And the species composition of the abundance of species does not change much across years. There can be different kinds of climax communities. So the first is called climax. So this kind of climax community is controlled by the climate of the region. Edaphic climax community are communities that are controlled by the soil conditions of the region. So basically based on the soil conditions of a given region, we have different population of different species that are present in this climatic community. Catastrophic climates are basically controlled by some catastrophic event, such as wildfire. So, for example, let's say you have teak forests. So, over time, what happens is other trees start growing here in between the teak. But these teak forests, which are deciduous forests and like fire resistant, they tend to shed their leaves annually. And these leaves basically tend to catch on fire, and this fire tends to eliminate these trees that are trying to come up and take over this forest. So basically, this community of teak plants is maintained because of regular annual wildfire. Right. Then we also have disclimax, where basically the climax community is controlled by some disturbance. So, for example, like agricultural field can be thought of as a climax community, where basically we are the ones which are controlling what is growing and what is not. So here are a few characteristics of climax community. So the climax community, the vegetation is tolerant of the environmental conditions, and climax communities generally have high species diversity, a well-formed spatial structure. So as I was telling you before, they have like canopies, they have understory, they have lower things in under the understory also in the ground. So grasses, herbs, and shrubs. And there's a complex food chain that is going on here. So basically, it's you have many different species that are interacting with each other, feeding on each other. Basically, these complex interactions and complex food chains provide stability because if uh, one of these organisms is not present, so for example, this species is not present, even then all of the other species can survive. So, but whereas if you have a very simple food chain and there is, let's say, collapse of a one population also, that might lead to collapse in other populations. And thus that will lead to like instability in the community. So generally, climax communities which are very stable have complex food chains that provide stability. There is equilibrium between the gross production and respiration. So basically between the uptake and release of nutrients and the gross production and the respiration. So the amount of um, nutrients that are taken up is equal to the amount of nutrients that are also released from the community. So what if that is not the case? Um, what if more nutrients are taken up and less nutrients are released? So what will happen is uh, if we have a community where more nutrients are taken up and less nutrients are released, so eventually the amount of nutrients that are present in the environment will decrease. And because of that, community will tend to like many of the species will tend to die and the community will tend to change. Right. If there is more release of nutrients and less uptake of nutrients, eventually it will lead to more deposition of nutrients in the environment. And there might be some species which might be better able to uh, uptake or utilize the nutrients, and these species might come up and change the what do you say structure of the community. Therefore, for a community to be stable, the gross production, respiration, the uptake and release of nutrients needs to be balanced. There needs to be equilibrium between all of these. The next point is the species composition continues to stay the same for a very long time in a climate community. The final thing is the climax community is a good indication of the climate and other conditions of the area because the vegetation is uh, because the community is tolerant of environmental conditions. It is also a good indication of the climate and other conditions that are found in the area. So, for example, if you see like um, trees, for example, what do you say? If you see a lot of evergreen tree species in a given area, you can estimate that the uh, climate and the other conditions such as the humidity, the temperature, and all the other climatic conditions or variables in that area will be very similar to evergreen forest because these species generally tend to grow in climates where these particular climatic variables are found that are similar to rainforest. Right. Now we can have three different kinds of succession. So the first is primary succession. So primary succession is basically succession that begins with colonization of an area that has not been previously occupied by any ecological community, such as exposed rock or sand surfaces, newly exposed glacial land, and lava flows. Secondary succession is successional dynamics following severe disturbance or removal of a pre-existing community. So, for example, if a area is destroyed by wildfire, then if a forest is destroyed by wildfire, the whole of the forest is destroyed by wildfire, or if it is cut down by humans, and then like there is succession or growth of uh, communities, formation of communities, that is known as secondary succession. The third thing is cyclic succession. So where basically periodic changes arise from species interactions or recurring events. So for example, as I was saying, teak forests have recurring annual wildfires. So these lead to cyclic, maybe forests which have annual recurring wildfires might also have like cyclic succession where like after every wildfire, some species come up and they tend to die off before the next in the next wildfire. Or areas where there's frequent volcanic activity, things like that. So we talked about this. So this is an example of lithosphere primary succession. So basically, as we said before, rocks, then comes crustose lichen. So these basically form crusts on the rock. Then foliose lichen, which look like leaves. Then the moss stage, and moss stage gives rise to herbaceous stage after formation of soil and humus. Then which gives rise to shrub stage, woodland stage, and basically the climax community in the area. Or a hydrosphere, if we have a primary succession, it might look something like this. So, for example, uh, you initially have water in this area, then basically you have development of these phytoplanktons in this water. Then slowly these phytoplanktons will die and fall to the bottom. So there is no nutrients in the bottom. Right. So these phytoplanktons are autotrophs. So they base photoautotrophs. So basically produce food by sunlight. When they fall down, they establish nutrients on the bottom of the pond or the water body. So this gives rise to like let's say submerged plants that are present inside the water. Then you might have plants that are reaching up and eventually plants that are floating on the water. The leaves, roots that are floating. Then you can have like a swamp kind of stage where the water is slowly trying to dry up and there's like more marshy area. Then we have sedge meadow stage and woodland stage. So eventually due to like more and more plants growing up, they basically take up the water and due to transpiration, they lose a lot of this water. So if this water body is very shallow, what will happen eventually is all that water will go away and we'll have like a woodland stage. And basically after that, we have a climax or a climatic community. Secondary succession, an example of secondary succession would be like, let's say we have a forest and there's a huge forest fire and the forest was incompletely destroyed. So then basically we can have herbs from here, then shrubs, woodland and climax stage. So since there are like spores and everything, seeds and everything, the growth will be accelerated. It will start from herbaceous stage and we won't have to go from lichens we won't have to start from lichens again, like in primary succession. So that's why basically secondary and cyclic succession are faster than primary succession because the soil is already formed in the area. There are spores and seeds that are already present in the soil. There is regeneration of some plants because of like roots that are remaining in the soil, and soil fertility is typically very high enough to support a lot of organisms compared to if we are starting from bare rocks where we might not have enough nutrients to support a lot of organisms. We can also have different other um, different kinds of succession based on basically how these successional changes are brought by. So, for example, autogenic succession is succession brought by changes in the soil caused by the organisms that are already present there. So, these include accumulation of organic matter in litter or alteration of soil nutrients by some species, or the change in the pH of soils due to some plants growing there. And we might also have another, so the other kind of succession is called allogenic succession, which is basically caused by external environmental influences and not by the vegetation that is already present in the area. So for example, soil changes due to erosion, leaching, or deposition of slit and clays are basically external factors that affect the nutrient content and the water present in the ecosystem. Other examples would include volcanic eruptions, flooding, droughts, earthquake, and non-anthropogenic factors such as climate change. So these are the various phases of succession. So the first phase is called nudation, where basically there's a development of a bare site called the nudation. This is caused by generally disturbance such as tectonic activity, volcanic activity, wildfires, and things like that. Then we have migration, where not like the normal definition of migration, this is not a population that is moving from one place to another. There's basically migration here refers to the arrival of propagules, which are basically seeds or spores that are coming to a given area. So this bare site. Then we have SSS, which basically is the establishment and initial growth of vegetation. Then we have aggregation, where the number and population density of different species increase. Then we have competition. So as the vegetation becomes very well established and grows and spreads, various species begin to compete for different resources such as space, light, and nutrients. Then we have reaction, where basically autogenic changes occur. So such as buildup of humus and changes in soil pH and stuff like that, which basically leads to one community replacing another. And then finally, we have stabilization, which is basically a supposedly stable climax community that is formed in the given area. Again, we have different theories that people have put forward to basically determine what will be the climatic vegetation or climatic um, community in a given area. So the first is called the monoclimax of the climatic climax theory, which was advanced by Clemens in 1916. So basically, Clemens states that there is only one climax whose characteristics are determined solely by climate, the processes of succession and modification of environment to overcome the effects of other factors such as topography, plant material of soil, and etc. So what this basically means is that, according to Clemens, if you have within a larger area, if you have two areas which have similar climatic conditions, then irrespective of what kind of succession occurs in both the areas, the final climatic community that will be present in both the areas will be one and the same. Okay, because the process of succession and modification of environment will overcome everything else, such as topography and the parent material of the soil and all of these. And basically, climate is the only factor that will determine what will be the final community that is present in that area. Then we have the polyclimax theory, which was advanced by Tansley in 1935, proposed by Tansley in 1935. So basically, he says that the climax restriction of a region consists of more than one vegetation climaxes, and it is controlled by various factors such as soil moisture, soil nutrients, topography, slope, fire, and animal activity. So even if these two areas have the same climatic conditions, they might have different climatic vegetation because of changes in soil moisture, soil nutrients, topography, and other such various different factors. Right. Then the final theory that we read about is called the climax pattern theory, which was advanced by Whittaker. So basically, Whittaker says that there is a variety of climaxes governed by responses of species population to biotic and abiotic conditions. The nature of climax vegetation will change as the environment changes, with the central and most widespread community being the climatic climax. So basically, what he means is that uh, there will be a variety of climatic communities which will be governed by how succession occurs or how different species in a community respond to different biotic and abiotic conditions. And he says that the nature of the climatic vegetation will change as the environment changes, but it will be very similar to some central and widespread community that will be called as the climatic climax. So the climatic climax can be, let's say, uh, something that is uh, most widespread in that given area, but based on the different region and different, what do you say, micro conditions that might be happening in different areas, the nature of the vegetation might change. Okay, does anyone have any questions till now? How does phytoplankton dispersion take place? So generally, I think via wind. So basically, these phytoplanktons are generally found in the oceans and other areas. So they generally tend to move from one place in the ocean to another, or from one pond to another, no, not from one pond to another, but from one water body to another by basically wind, or let's say if some animal is carrying some water from one place to another, things like that. Mostly. I'm not sure, I'll have to check, but yeah. I'll get back to you at the end. Does anyone else have any questions? So the final lecture was on community organization. So we learned about relative density, relative frequency, and relative dominance. So here we define dominance as the basal area of species as X divided by total basal area of all the species. But there can be different kinds of dominance. So the first kind of dominance is a dominant species, which is called the keystone species. So basically, a keystone species is a species that plays a role that is greater than their numerical abundance. So basically, for example, let's say we have a ficus tree. So a ficus tree is very large and it can generally support a lot of different organisms. So many of the ficus fruits, ficus leaves, and all such parts are edible, and thus it might be supporting a large group of or species community of birds. It might be supporting a large community of insects, and these insects will also support a large community of insectivorous birds. So there'll be insectivorous birds and there'll be frugivorous birds. We'll also have some reptiles like lizards, geckos, chameleons, and stuff that will also be found here. So basically, this ficus tree, because even if it might be very less in a given community, it plays a very greater role because it provides for a lot of different resources that can be utilized by a lot of different species or population. The other thing is numerical abundant species are also known as dominant species because if a species is present in very large numbers, it generally determines the nature of the community. So, for example, in a sal forest, a sal tree is the most dominant species because it is present in the most number. Right. So, we also learned about the community dominance index, which is basically the percentage of abundance that is contributed by the two most abundant species. So, for example, let's say we have these four species and we have two areas. Here, let's say we have abundance. Right. So in this case, to calculate the community dominance index, we'll use the, so let's say this is 16. We'll use these two species, 20 plus 16, divided by the whole thing. And in this case, it will be 20,000 plus 20 divided by the whole thing. Right. So let's calculate 20 plus 16, 20, 30, 50, 61. Right. So we will say 36 by 61. This is close to, let's say, 0.4, and this will be close to 0.4. This is multiplied by 100. So 100 into this will be close to 40%, and in this case, it will be close to, let's say, 100%. So if the community dominance index is very high, that means very few species or these one or two species are dominating in the community. But if the community dominance index is low, that means there's not a lot of dominance in that community, and the abundance of the species is basically spread out. Abundance of different species is comparable. So abundance here can be measured in terms of density, biomass, or productivity. Okay. So what is the relationship between the dominance index and the diversity? So as you have more and more number of species, generally the dominance index tends to decrease because if you have more number of species, the denominator here will keep on increasing, but the numerator might not change, right? The total abundance of all the species here will keep on increasing. That's why you will have lower dominance index if the number of species increases. But this relationship is very like slightly weak. So when people tried this out in nature for invertebrate communities on decaying oak logs, they found that there might be a slight decrease because if you try, we can fit a line like this, but it is not very tight because we can also have lines like this that also explain the data. Or the R square of this line is not that great, very low. So this relationship is not very tight. But there is another relationship which is generally very tight. So as the dominance index tends to increase, the productivity of a given community tends to increase. And this is because to become dominant in a given community, a species has to be very efficient. So if a species is very efficient at utilizing resources, only then it can outcompete other species that are present in the community to grow in number. And if one species is dominating, then the dominance index will be high. And if basically the abundance of that species is very high, therefore the productivity of the whole community increases. So as the dominance index tends to increase, the productivity of the given community also tends to increase. The other thing is dominance can change with the surroundings on the environment. So for example, this is from a what do you say, experiment that was carried out in the Marion Lake in British Columbia, where artificial enrichment of the lake was done by adding phosphorus and nitrogen. So this graph here, this dotted line here, basically corresponds to nutrient concentration. So before day zero is when the nutrient was added. Before day zero, the concentration is at some level. On day zero, there's this very high shoot because we add a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. Right. Nitrogen and phosphorus is added. And then it slowly decreases as it is getting utilized by the different species. Right. Now, on this solid line, what we see is basically the standing crop. So this is basically the number of individuals. So this suddenly tends to increase quite a bit. And we have what is called a algal bloom. So basically some species of these phytoplankton community, they tend to increase quite a bit. And after that, as the nutrients decrease, the, what do you say? The it can no longer sustain the growth of this species, and therefore it tends to decrease and fall off, and it goes back to almost the same level that was there before. Right. So the number of species tends to stay the same, and they found that the species diversity tends to decrease and then again tends to increase and come back to the same. So basically, in this initial condition, there was no dominance because there was just basically, uh, what do you say? Uh, there were limiting nutrients and everyone was competing for nutrients and it could not support a large number of organisms. So, for example, let's say we had four species of phytoplankton that are present. And basically, let's say they were all limited by different things. So for example, this is limited by sunlight. This is limited by pH. This is limited by temperature. So the temperature is not favorable for this. And let's say this was limited by nutrient. Right. So the number of um, individuals was not quite high because all these factors were limiting for all these different species. Now, when we added nitrogen and phosphorus, what happened was we removed this limitation, the nutrient limitation. And so the number of individuals or species too tend to increase quite a lot. But since we just added the nutrient once, so eventually as the number of individuals increase quite a lot, so the dominance changed. So since we changed the surroundings by adding nutrients, the dominance also changed. So initially there was no phytoplankton species dominating, but after a point we see that this species too was then dominating the uh, community. And after some time, as the nutrient concentration tend to decrease, these species once then again started to compete with each other, and the resources got limiting, and thus the number of the abundance of this species also tend to decrease. Okay, so as we see here, basically in the beginning and in the end, all the things, the nutrient concentration, number of species, the species diversity, and the standing crop basically tends to return to the same value, right? So basically, the community is going through a change, but it is coming back to the same, almost similar conditions. So community stability is defined as the ability of a community to defy any change or to rebound from any change that is happening. Okay. So there can be there are basically three kinds of stability. So the first is called a global stability. So basically, the community is now in this environmental condition. Now, if you were, let's say, to change the environment condition to something like this or something like this, what will happen is eventually this community will tend to go back to this. So even if you add a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, or if you remove a lot of, if you add a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, or you change the amount of sunlight that is present or something like that, you're basically disturbing the community. But uh, if the community has global stability, it will eventually come back to the same point. Now, the second case is the case where the community is locally stable. So here what happens is if you push it to slightly different environmental conditions, it will come back to the same local community. But if you push it beyond a certain point, what will happen is it will go to another local community. So the community will change if you push it slightly more. Now, in the third case, even in the case of like globally stable uh, communities, if you push them beyond to a very large extent, so very large disturbance you create, what will happen is some species will go extinct and some species will then colonize the community, and thus it will lead to like irreversible changes to the community. So generally, people say that if an area is more biodiverse, then it has a very high stability. So, uh, you want to ask, does diversity increase the stability of a given area? So there can be various counter arguments that can be put forward to show that maybe diversity is not the only thing that affects stability. So let's say, for example, first we make an argument that pest outbreaks occur more often in cultivated land, and cultivated land has less diversity. And maybe because of this less diversity, there are more pest outbreaks in cultivated land and less pest outbreaks in like um, other areas, such as natural forests. The counter argument here one can put forward is that there is no co-evolutionary history with the pest and the uh, basically plants that are grown in the cultivated land. Whereas there is some co-evolutionary history that is present between the pests and the forest area. And therefore, due to this ecology, the forest has evolved in such a way so that it can manage these pest outbreaks. So instead of diversity, there might be some ecological factor or some trophic relation that might be controlling the pest. Right. So it might not be just the diversity of the forest. The second argument that one can make is that tropical rainforests, which are more diverse, have fewer pest outbreaks than temperate forests. Here, the counter argument can be that tropical forests have not been studied enough when compared to temperate forests, and therefore we may not know of pest outbreaks that might be occurring in tropical rainforests also. Right. So there might be different reasons why this stability is there. Biodiversity might be just one part of it. Okay. So, yeah. So in the end, there is no direct relationship between the diversity and the stability of a community, but several experiments have suggested that very simple systems or very simple communities are inherently unstable because it only takes a few mistakes or a few changes to topple that community. So for example, as before, if we have a community of, let's say, a very simple food chain, if only one species is affected, the whole community is affected. Whereas if you have a very complex or slightly more complex sort of food chain, what happens is even if one species uh, dies off or is affected, that even in the absence of one species, the community does not suffer a lot because there are other pathways for all the different species to survive. And even if the number of individuals of this species decreases, it can slowly bounce back to normal, thus increasing stability. So the next question arises is how does a system respond to instability? So as we saw before, if we basically make some changes or make a system unstable, we see that it goes through a phase of change, but then it comes back to normal. So what, how do systems respond to this instability? So there are two things. So the first is called resistance. So resistance is a measure of how little the variable of interest changes in response to external pressure. And this resistance generally occurs due to inertia, which is basically the ability of living systems to resist external fluctuations. So basically, resistance is like, um, so for example, we have two beakers, and this one has water, and this one has some buffer. Let's say we add 1 ml of H2SO4 to it. And again, we add 1 ml of H2SO4 to it. So here initially, let's say the pH was 7. After adding the acid, the pH became 4. Whereas here, initially the pH was 7, but after adding that 1 ml of acid, the pH became 6.9. Right. So here we say that this buffer solution is more resistant than the water solution because the variable of interest, that is the pH, shows very little change in response to external pressure such as addition of acid. Right. Now, in a living system or in a community, what might happen is, for example, we have a pond. So there are some phytoplanktons, there are some plants, and there are some fishes. So these fishes eat the phytoplanktons. So now let's say there are we add a lot of nutrients and the number of phytoplanktons tend to increase. So what happens is the number of fish also tends to increase and the amount of predation on these phytoplanktons tend to increase. So the number of phytoplankton eventually decreases back to normal. And after that, the number of fish also, if it has increased, it will come back to normal. So basically, inertia is basically the ability, this ability that living systems have to resist external fluctuations or changes. The other thing that we can talk about apart from stability is something called resilience. So resilience is the tendency of a system to retain its functional and organizational structure after a perturbation or disturbance. So it is measured generally in terms of elasticity and amplitude. So basically, let's say we have an ecosystem like this. This is, let's say, the number of species. Then, our, yeah, then let's say here we have some disturbance that is occurring. So basically, the system decreases and then after some time comes back to normal. Now, there might be another system given the same amount of disturbance. So, let's say some amount of disturbance, given the same amount of disturbance, there might be another system that goes down and comes up like this. Right. So here, the first system is the system A and system B, let's say. The first system, system A, comes back to normal in, let's say, this much time. And system B comes back to normal in, let's say, this much time. Right. So the elasticity is basically, so let's say this is This is 0. This is time for A. This is time for B. Right. So basically, we say that A has more elasticity because the speed at which it returns back to normal is greater than B. So B takes more time to come back to normal, whereas A comes back to normal pretty fast. Amplitude is basically a measure of how far a system can be moved before the player and still return back to the same state. So let's say now, we have another system. Basically, initially we had this much amount of disturbance, and so it came back to normal, just this. Now let's say we increase the amount of disturbance in the system. Let's say the amount of disturbance is increased. Now what happens? The system goes down and it doesn't come up to the same level. So basically it has a dip now. So let's say A, this is A prime. Right. So amplitude is basically a measure of how far a system can be moved from the previous state and still return. So basically, if you move the system this much, it can still return. But if you move the system this much, it will not return back to normal. There will be a discrepancy between the original or the previous state and the final state, to the disturbance. So this is known as amplitude. So, talk about a case study. So where basically uh, talk about Lake Washington, where a lot of sewage was initially added, and eventually, after some time, government there decided to reduce the amount of sewage that was put into the lake, and eventually decrease it down to 0%. So here we see that initially a lot of sewage was added, 100%, and then slowly the amount of sewage was reduced in steps, and finally it decreased to almost 0%. Now, here we can see that as the amount of sewage increase, the amount of dissolved phosphorus in the lake also increase. But as the amount of sewage decrease and became 0, the amount of phosphorus decreased and stabilized at a certain point. Great. Next, we see, so basically the sewage had a lot of, what do you say, nutrients in the form of phosphorus, nitrogen, and all. And eventually, basically, after we stopped adding the sewage, the excess phosphorus that was still dissolved in the water was used up by organisms and eventually stabilized to its normal number. Right. Then we also see that as the sewage water was being added, the Secchi depth decreases. So this is before and this is after. So the Secchi depth was measured using a Secchi disc. So we have a disc like this. It has four parts, two of them are black, two of them are white. There's a rod. It's basically used to dip it into the water and see till how much depth you can distinguish between the black and the white part of the disc. Okay. So after removal of sewage, the water became clearer and clearer and the Secchi depth tend to increase. Okay. The other thing that people showed was, so in 1933, before any sewage was put into the area, the amount of phosphate and chlorophyll was, the concentration was somewhere around, let's say, 10% and 25%. Then after adding sewage, what happened was the amount of nitrate, amount of phosphate and chlorophyll increased due to algal blooms. But after the sewage treatment was done and after the sewage, they stopped adding the sewage, slowly these numbers decreased and came back almost close to the initial values. Right. So what this basically tells us is the chlorophyll basically indicates the amount of algae that is there. So when sewage was being added, the amount of algae was quite high, but slowly it decreased. And phosphate is basically the amount of phosphate that is there. We see that the amount of nitrate also increased, but it has not come down as much as the phosphate. So that also does not like matter a lot because what matters is so according to Leibniz's law of limitation, what happens is limiting law. What is stated is that basically uh, even if all other resources are present in abundance, if the amount of growth that occurs is dependent on the amount of resource that is present the least. So even if there are nitrates and other things that are present in the water, the amount of phosphate is low, and that is the reason why there is not a lot of growth here. Right. So the takeaway from this case study is that detrimental changes can be stopped and reversed if given enough time and if reversed within its limits. So we cannot push a community or ecosystem beyond its amplitude, which is basically how far the system can be moved and still return back to normal. And we need to give it some time based on the elasticity. So how much time it takes to come back to normal. That's it for today. Um, does anyone have any questions? Phytoplankton dispersion, we'll just take a look. So basically, phytoplanktons are generally moved by wind and ocean currents, but some phytoplanktons like dinoflagellates have their own cilia and flagella that help them move. So for determining the basal area, the height is generally chosen to be chest height or breast height, which is generally 1.3 to 1.5 meters above ground. So basically, that's where we measure the girth and then estimate the basal area from the girth. If both two species are associated in both type A and type B, can they be considered symbiotic? Not necessarily. Two species might be uh, found in the same area, so but they might not exactly be symbiotic. So one second. For example, I'll just so for example, mm, we might have so type A associations are basically where both the species are present, and type A associations are associations where basically both species are absent, right? So we might have species A and species B, and we might see that when we are taking quadrats in a given area, we find that in a quadrat, either both of them are present or both of them are absent, right? So this is basically type A, this is basically type D association. So even though we see this, we cannot conclusively say that they have some relation or some interaction between them until and unless we observe that, because it might be such that there might be some species C which might be indirectly affecting both of them. So either by positively increasing species A and species B or negatively affecting species A and species B. So these two species might not have any interaction or any symbiotic, what do you say, relation between each other, but it might just be driven by some other species. So until and unless we see some, what do you say, interactions between these two species, we cannot say anything if they're symbiotic or not, just based on the type of association based on quadrats. Is that clear? Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. So just to recap, we started with what is a community, what is ecotone. We talked about community attributes, characteristics, description of a community. How do you determine the importance of a species? Then basically association between species, or what are the different theories of why communities exist. Then we talked about guilds. We talked about niche, the fundamental niche and the realized niche of different species. We talked about what are the characteristics of niche. We talked about the index of similarity, association of a species with community, and based on that, how we define different kinds of species. We talked about ecological succession, and we saw how it happens for lithosphere landscape. We talked about seer, we talked about pioneer species and a climax community. We talked about characteristics of all of them. We talked about the kinds of succession based on basically the succession is happening from a new area, or if it is happening after disturbance, or if it is happening periodically due to cyclic disturbance or fluctuations. We talked about primary succession in lithosphere, primary succession in hydrosphere, secondary succession in lithosphere. We talked about the different kinds of succession based on how the changes are brought by, if they are brought by the organisms present there, or if they're being caused by external environmental influences. We talked about the phases of succession and the theories of climatic communities, or theories how climatic communities are formed, and how do they vary, or what basically determines the climatic community of a given area. We then talked about dominance, community dominance index, relationship between diversity and dominance, relationship between dominance and productivity. And we also talked about how uh, surroundings and changes in surroundings can change dominance. We talked about community stability, the different kinds of stability, local and global, and how if you push a system far enough, it might lead to large-scale extinctions and colonization events. We talked about diversity and stability and how do systems respond to instability. We talked about resilience, and we then looked at a case study in Lake Washington. So that's all for today. I'll see you guys next week. Thanks for coming. And yeah, we'll meet next week. Thanks. Bye.